Everyone, welcome to part 2 of chapter 28, the reproductive system. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the reproductive system in terms of female reproduction. So we're going to look at how that works. So last lectures, we went through the basics of it. We discussed meiosis and mitosis. Then we discussed regulation of male sperm production. Now we're going to look at female. Now, males and females, at least in their reproductive thing, the first two functions are the same: producing sex hormones and producing sex cells or gametes. Now, it is the third thing here that I want to make sure we see that is so distinctively different, and it is the fact that we must protect, support, and nourish a baby. Protect, support an embryo to a fetus, and then to a newborn, and nourish that said newborn with the breasts. So the uterus and the breasts play an important role in protection, support, and nourishing. Now, like the males, the gonads and ducts and structures are found here. Now, females' gonads, two of them, the ovaries and the uterine tubes, are the ducts that transport those. The uterus, though, is unique as this holds the baby, and the vagina being the part of the genitalia where the penis is inserted for sex, and the accessory structures, things like the Bartholin's glands, etc., that we're going to talk about, the clitoris and things like that, the vulva. So, as we get into the anatomy, and I'm sorry, I thought I had actually blown that up. So, the corpus luteum. This is the first structure I want to talk about, and that's our structure that we use to produce the hormones, sex hormones for females, specifically the estrogens and the progesterone hormone. It's a structure called the corpus luteum. Now, it's not here all the time. We'll talk about it. The corpus luteum is produced, it goes away. And we'll talk about that endocrine structure. We didn't talk about it in lab, but we're going to talk about it here. The tunica albuginea, that is the outer dense connective tissue layer. Then the suspensory ligament called the infundibulopelvic ligament, better seen right here, and a little bit here, but right here. Actually contains the ovarian artery and vein. Then the ovarian ligament, which is also better seen here and here, is stabilizing the ovary. Females' tubes, referred to as the uterine tubes, they're about 13 centimeters in length. They're hollow muscular tubes that in which the oocyte, when it is ovulated, will travel through this tube to get to the uterus. And on it are these structures called fimbriae that are kind of like the kind of make it think of it like a catcher's glove or a baseball glove to help you catch a baseball. It makes it a little bit easier to catch a baseball like that. The idea, guys, with fimbriae, they're going to expand finger-like projections, and then they go into the infundibulum, the funnel-like structure that takes us into the ampulla, which ultimately goes into the isthmus. Now, also, mesovarium will be located between the ovary and the uterine tube, located here, this very thick and folded mesentery. Typically, between about here and this area right around here is where usually fertilization will take place, actually. So, quite a long swim up through the vagina into whichever side ovulated that month. So, we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, the female's uterus, you have with an embryo. Now, generally, what we say is the first 8 weeks we call an embryo, and then we refer to up from a fetus, and then 9 weeks to delivery. Week 9 is your now fetus all the way through delivery for 9 months. So this first 8 weeks, we kind of call that the embryo. Then you have a fetus, and then you deliver a baby, a newborn. Now, mechanically supporting and protecting the fetus as it develops, or the embryo as it develops, nutritional support, waste removal, nutritional support via the placenta. It is somewhat shaped like a pear. Now, again, it's roughly 7.5 centimeters in length, about 5 centimeters in diameter, and somewhere between 50 to 100 grams. I never actually test on the anatomical parameters, the sizes and volumes and things like that. It's not something I generally do. I mean, I do ask on the organs, what they do, things like that, for sure, but now, just for, I always like to say, okay, it's pear-shaped and this is its rough dimensions. The dimensions and parameters of that are something I don't test on. Now, as we look into these anatomical parts, we think of the body. By far the biggest part of it, with a fundus at the top, the rounded portion, and at the bottom of it, which makes it pear-shaped, kind of like an upside-down pear. If you don't know what a pear is, the fruit, the pear. Now, if you're listening to this in other parts of the country or part of the world, rather, pears may not be something you normally eat. So, but it is a fruit that's somewhat shaped, where it's wider on one side, more narrow on the other. The cervix has two openings to what's called the cervical canal. The internal os is actually going from the uterus to the cervix, cervical canal, and the external os goes from the vagina to the cervix. Also, we'll talk about a broad ligament, roughly, that mesentery that actually covers everything, covers the ovaries, uterus, uterine tubes. The round ligament, which actually prevents backwards movement, posterior movement of uterus. The uterosacral ligament, which actually goes to the sides or the lateral surface of the uterus and to the front or anterior surface of the sacrum. And then we'll talk about the two pouches, the rectouterine and vesicouterine. Remember, recto, we're thinking rectum, so we're talking colon. It is the back of the uterus, posterior wall of the uterus, to the front of the colon, the anterior wall of the colon. And vesico, vesicus, blister or bladder. Vesico references blister or bladder. And the bladder here in this case is so the uterus and the back of the bladder, the posterior wall of the bladder, urinary bladder. All right. And I'm not going to go and point these out so much now as we did in lab. Now, what I do want to talk about is the wall of the uterus with its three major layers, and we can see these pretty well. We have this outer perimetrium, and it's just a serous membrane. Then our myometrium is layer of muscle tissue. Myometrium gives us the muscle that actually causes contractions, and then the innermost line called the endometrium. And that is what is lost during menstruation, specifically the functional layer. There is a functional layer and a basilar layer or basal layer of that. Now, these are supplied to different areas. Now, one of the things we want to talk about, there are blood vessels that extend in and create an arc of arteries that kind of arc out, called arcuate arteries. Kind of like in the kidney, the arcuate arteries. And they encircle the endometrium from underneath, and they will give these radial artery branches that come out, and then they will give these smaller kinds of spiral arteries that supply the functional layer. The basilar layer or basal layer is more supplied straight from these straight arteries here, and then the curly spiral arteries go to supply blood directly to the functional layer. They will play a big role in menstruation, okay? Now, the vagina, we say it is an elastic muscular tube, which means it does contract. It is stretchable. It goes from cervix to vestibule. It's somewhere around about 7.5 to 9 centimeters in length. It's distendable, which we would say is stretchy because childbirth has to occur through that. So it needs to be incredibly highly distendable. But this is where menstrual fluids are eliminated. This is where sexual intercourse, receiving of sperm in the penis during sexual intercourse. And this is the bottom or inferior part of the birth canal. So it plays a major role. Menstrual fluid is lost here. The menstrual flow that occurs in a woman is lost there as well. So loads of things are going on there. Now the fornix, we talked about there's an extension of the vagina. It extends with basically the cervix extension there. It's part of the cervix that goes into the vagina, and there's a recess that is produced because of that. And then the rugae are the folds in the vagina. Now, we talk about the mons pubis in lab, and so that's adipose above the pubic symphysis that acts as a cushion. There are the two labia, the labia majora and minora, major and minor labia. Loads of words we can call it: labium majora, labium minora, labium majus, labium minus. Sometimes it's called or major and minor labia. These are the outer and inner folds of the vagina, of the part of the vulva. The vestibule is the space located between the minor labia. The clitoris is located anteriorly in the vulvar area, which has erectile tissues. Loads of nerves that are important for sexual arousal. And in here are the Bartholin's glands, and these are what secrete into the vaginal entrance when a female is aroused. So these glands, as we said, sometimes as females get older, will no longer secrete, and this may. So this is something that like if you're dealing with an older patient who's postmenopausal, and they are still wanting to have a romantic relationship with their significant other postmenopausal, they may need to use a personal lubricant. So we're not going to sit and point it all out, but I do have those there. And I do want to talk about the breast anatomy because this is what feeds the baby. We have the mammary glands. These provide nutrition for the baby, the breast or mammary glands. There are various lobes. One entire group here is a lobe. And the lobes are made up of many lobules. Lobules are made up of little tiny secretory alveoli, and the secretory alveoli each make milk. They make milk into the lactiferous ducts that then go into lactiferous sinuses out to the nipple. Those chambers are there and enlarged. They allow like a continual stream and flow of milk. It kind of prevents like gas from getting in, sort of, so that milk comes out in a steady stream. The nipple is just the extension of the gland outside, and surrounding that is the areola. Now, I do talk frequently about the anatomy because I always go back over it, and you'll notice that I try to do exactly what my labs do because I always like to reiterate the things. I think it helps students to see it more than once. Now, as we look inside the ovary, one thing you're going to see is follicles. And what is a follicle? Well, a follicle is basically an oocyte at a very specific stage in development, and it's surrounded by cells called follicular cells. So these follicular cells here, we have an oocyte here, and it is surrounded by follicular cells, and this combination we call a follicle. Now, they undergo many changes. For example, a primary, secondary, and tertiary follicle. Now, sometimes you have this different types of oocytes inside. And we'll talk about those. Now, inside there is this tissue called the stroma. It's the superficial and deeper cortex, deeper medulla. That is the internal stuff inside. And gametes get produced in the cortex of that. The cortex, the stroma, which is the cortex, is more superficial. Now, in here is a corpus luteum, and we said it's an endocrine structure, and it makes progesterone as well as estrogen. Well, most of our estrogen is produced here by the follicle cells, and we'll talk about that, but this is mostly going to be progesterone secretion. Pro means it's in favor of, gest from gestation or pregnancy. Own means it's a steroid, so it is a steroid that favors pregnancy. That's what this word progesterone means. Okay. Now, we did this in the last class, and we talked about it in the last lecture. I have to flip this thing because I had to unplug some stuff after I finished, and I had to go do something else real quick and come back while everything compiles. It takes a while for me to get these things loaded onto your pages. So what I want to do is about oogenesis now. Now, this happens in the ovary. Now, it begins before puberty. And if you can hear my dog, I'm so sorry. They went crazy before, and now they're just being crazier again. All right, so one thing about this is it starts before puberty, continues monthly after puberty. Actually, it starts before birth, I would even say. It starts before birth. you begin oogenesis before birth in a female. Now, one of the big things I want to talk about is that the idea that a female has these pauses and breaks in it, that is kind of important and a very useful thing to kind of think about here. So what I want to do is talk about it, that it begins before birth. Now, before birth, so this means this is kind of a mind-boggling thing. If you think this process begins before a female is born, that means when she's born, she has all the oocytes she's ever going to have. Now, that in itself is incredibly interesting, but let's go a little bit further with this. Let's take it to its logical conclusion. That means that the oocyte that was fertilized to make every one of you guys that were listening to me was inside your mother's ovaries while she was still inside your grandmother's uterus. Okay? Now that blows my mind. I don't know about you, but the egg that was fertilized to produce you was still inside your mother while she was still inside your grandmother. Now, this cell is 2N diploid called a primordial germ cell. We're going to start just like men. Primordial germ cell. Okay, we're going to start just like men. Now, what I'm going to do, guys, is discuss this as that we have the same basic things happen. Is an event of mitosis will occur. I meant to draw it going like that. One replaces the other. And what we end up producing here is a cell that is called an oogonium that we're going to talk about. And this cell will be 2N as it was done by mitosis. These must be equivalent. These must be the same. So it's 2N called an oogonium. And this oogonium here, of course, is going to have in it the same composition of chromosomes that we had before. Now, let's follow this little oogonium. Now, this oogonium will undergo mitosis. And we're just going to go and follow one oogonium. And it's this guy right here that I'm really going to talk about is a cell that has 2 copies of each chromosome. So we know it is diploid, 2N, diploid. It is called a primary oocyte. Now, here is the really fascinating thing. This primary oocyte, basically what we're going to do, and I kind of like to give it like this. This is kind of how I like to do it when I teach it, is I imagine there's traffic lights here. And we are going to have the green light come on here. And with green light, this traffic light, the green light for meiosis 1. But what we're going to do is we're going to start to let, now by the way, this was a mitosis. I probably said it. But we're going to let meiosis 1 happen. Now, what I want to mention, meiosis 1 is going to start to happen. Now, this is what's incredibly bizarre about females. This oogonium here, as it starts to undergo that, it will go to prophase 1 and meiosis 1. So what you're actually going to do is this cell here will get to prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and it stops. Okay, we're going to make it stop and go to prophase 1 of meiosis 1, and we're going to make it stop there. We're not going to let it go any further. So it's done synapsis and that kind of stuff, but we're not going to let it go any further, okay? We're going to make this stop right here, and we're going to make this sit. Now, all of this right here was before birth. This happened fairly early in development. Now, one of the things I want to talk about here is that in females, the other interesting things, when it goes into prophase 1 and it goes into an arrested state, this cell here now after birth, after puberty, monthly. This happens only once a month. Is this little guy here, what's going to happen is we're now finally going to take this one here and we are going to turn on the green light, but this has been years, like say 12 or 13 years or even more, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to let this cell complete meiosis 1. Now, when this cell completes meiosis 1, something very bizarre happens. Meiosis 1 happens, but it doesn't happen as in males. Notice over here in males, meiosis 1 happens and it's all pretty equal. Here, it will not be equal. One is going to be quite small. One of these cells is going to be quite small. And this cell, as it completes meiosis 1 here, meiosis 1 finally completes after puberty, and she's ready to ovulate, but she's not even ovulating yet, okay? She makes what is called a first polar body, okay? Now, this cell over here, and this cell, these cells are N haploid cells. They are haploid, okay? They are referred to as these. This one here is called a I'm going to write it here. Is called a secondary oocyte, and he is haploid. Both these cells here are haploid cells, where this cell is diploid. First polar body and secondary oocyte, and you can see they only have one copy of each chromosome. Now, eventually what's going to happen is as we let it finish, okay, this is also, it's something that's going to happen is there is a secondary oocyte that is formed here, and it's going to begin meiosis 1. Now, there is something else very weird that happens, okay? First off, we're going to have this. These will be called second polar bodies from meiosis 2, okay? But meiosis 2, now the thing I want to say about meiosis 2 is this. There is a catch. And they only happen under one condition, okay? You only allow it to happen under one specific condition. This will happen. And the only way this will happen, that meiosis 2 ever completes in females, is if fertilized. Now let's just say this one here. I'm going to put a blue one here, and we fertilize it, okay? Or put a red one in here, doesn't matter. We can put one in here and we fertilize it. If fertilized, we allow, only if fertilized, second meiosis to occur. And you will end up with 1, 2, 3 second polar bodies and one egg that is fertilized. But there are pauses. Number one, there is this really long pause between before birth and then after puberty, monthly. There is, you start to let meiosis happen, and then it pauses, and then once a month, we're going to let a primary oocyte undergo complete prophase 1. And then, like I said, there is another kind of stop here, and I'm going to talk about it. You have to meet a caveat. You have to fertilize. Only if fertilized. Now, that is also in itself a very odd thing. You must fertilize it, okay? Now, what I want to help you guys understand is that there are loads of pauses and breaks. Now, in fact, what I like to do when I'm teaching it, on one of my courses that I teach, let me grab the notes for that course. I was going to show you because something I talk about when I do, this is a non-majors biology course, and I do like to discuss some things with them. And one of the things I always discuss is these problems with meiosis. And this one is a mother's risk of getting Down syndrome with age. And after 35, it starts to considerably go up by 40, by 45, by 50. It is quite high. There is roughly 80 in 1,000 births will be Down syndrome. Okay. Now, this partly right here begins to explain part of that. When I teach it, what I always kind of say is, I said, let's imagine right here, it's like you hit the pause button on a game and you go eat dinner and you come back, spend an hour, come back, you try to pick up the game, and when you unpause it, the game kind of shuts, crashes. Well, sometimes if you have one sitting and we have this in arrested state of prophase 1, and we're stuck at prophase 1, and then try to complete it sometimes 45 years later, there could be issues. And that's what happens, okay? So this is non-straight line. What I always say is oogenesis, it's not a straight line, okay? And when I say it's not a straight line, I mean that there are pauses and breaks. But in males, it is a straight line because there are no pauses and breaks. And this is a way I like to kind of describe it to kind of help iterate that point, because one of the big things that I always emphasize in my courses that I discuss this is the dramatic differences here. And you're only getting one. Now, normally what happens is many, let's say about 6 primary oocytes will attempt to undergo anyway, meiosis 1. They'll all kind of, it's almost like the Hunger Games. And you might have 6 or 8, let's say. Let's just give like a number that we can kind of which is pretty close to accurate. Let's say we have like 6 or 8 of these cells, and they're basically undergoing the Hunger Games, and basically one of them gets to come out, and one of them gets to become a secondary oocyte to be ovulated. Ovulation happens. But only if fertilization occurs do you get to complete meiosis 2. If fertilization occurs here, and I like to use these little things, it's to me just a way I kind of understand it sometimes. I like to use little images and things like that to help me also kind of visualize that, hey, we're allowing this to go, but now we're stopping it. We're allowing it to go again. Now we're stopping it. We're stopping it again, and we're allowing it to go, etc. Okay? So these processes are non-straight line. Not all primordial follicles actually survive to puberty. There is a thing called atresia. You lose them also as you get to puberty because a bunch of them try to undergo to become the dominant follicle to actually be ovulated. Once they produce the primary oocytes, what's present at birth, but they are in prophase 1 of meiosis 1, or prophase of meiosis 1, and that continues on, and you get your first polar bodies, and that happens because cytokinesis is not equal in female gametogenesis, and oogenesis is not equal. And I see a little thing that I need to do because I talked about it a little bit, but I always get bugged that I didn't have that way. It bugs me, okay? I'm sorry. Sorry, I got a little bit loud there. Now, we talk about this, and an egg is called a fertilized secondary oocyte. And only do secondary oocytes only actually complete. They only actually are able to complete if they are fertilized. And I don't think I had that there, but that is the case. And you can see here as well that fertilization will allow that. So you will have 3 second polar bodies and 1 first polar body. Okay. Now, atresia is just that degeneration. We have that. We also lose some between when you start. At birth, you have about 2 million primordial follicles. When you're born, by puberty, you got about 400,000 of those. Atresia is the degeneration of the ones that aren't dominant, that do not mature. What happens is, as you also go in, you lose them, you degenerate them, you lose some once a month. Let's say 6 or 8 enter, only 1 leaves sometimes. Now, that doesn't always mean. Now, sometimes you can have 2 dominant follicles and have 2 ovulate. There are double ovulations. That does happen. And that is an interesting thing that can happen. But what you get is 1 ovary 1 month, then the next month the other ovary. That's why there's 2 of them. Now in males, it's both testes are producing sperm all the time. So very interesting. Now, females and males both, we use GnRH to help us produce our sex hormones. Now, I want to make a couple points. Number one point I want to make is that just because we use GnRH to make them, it is not always equivalent to say that GnRH and in males and females release in the exact same way. Females, the levels change. Males pulse about every 60 to 90 minutes. Where females, their levels change throughout the entirety of the cycle. Now, we're going to see that there is GnRH. Now, here's also a clincher, a very big difference. Now, in males, GnRH causes the production and release of FSH and LH. That happened pretty much simultaneously, but not in females. In females, GnRH will cause the production of FSH. It will cause the production of LH. It will cause the secretion of FSH, but not LH. LH does not get secreted until estrogen levels get high enough. Okay, there will be a kind of threshold level for that has to happen, and that also adds some more complexity to this matter. Now, we'll talk about it. One of the big things I want to mention is the female cycle. Overall is a very complex thing. So to understand the female reproductive cycle, what we are going to do is we're going to draw this out, and I'm going to use a mnemonic that says FOLDMAPS, fold maps, and we'll take and we'll use that mnemonic in a minute. Let's talk about it. So what I want to do is let's talk about some pie. And we're going to slice our pie like this. So I'm only getting 3 slices. I got 1/2 and then 2/4. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have some dates. 0 through 28 will be our days that we want to have indicated here. Now, first off, day 0 to day 28. Now, a big one is day 7 and day 14. And around day 14, I'm going to put some kind of what I'm going to think of as some wiggle room bits. And right in here is something that can happen, very important. Okay, now, what I do is there is 2 major areas. There is the ovarian and there is the uterine cycle, okay? Now, what we're going to do, we're going to break this down into 2 colors. Let's just use green and red. And let's just pick uterine and ovarian, okay? So let's start with the way we did in our book, in our notes. Okay, the ovarian cycle. Now, fold maps. Well, we have the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle. We'll begin ovarian like the book does. The book does FOL. So FOL. Okay, so what you have is there is from about day 0 of the phase, and we're going to go all the way around, all the way around, all the way around, all the way around, and right around day 14 with the little wiggle room that's in here. This is called the follicular phase. Now, follicular phase, this is when your primary oocytes are going to develop into secondary oocytes. That's when the events we just drew happen, okay, is follicular. Now, as that develops, you get this area here called the ovulatory phase. The ovulatory phase. Okay, ovulatory. That is when you release your secondary oocyte for ovulation. It happens right around day 14. Now, on this, and again, some wiggle room because there is, especially here, these are very distinctly different. Now, I will say that this is the most consistent half right here. And this is called the luteal phase. The luteal phase is when the corpus luteum is present. And this is the ovarian part of fold maps. Now, M, P, S. So follicular phase is about days 1 through 14. This is around about day 14, and this is about day 14 to 28, okay, roughly. Now, again, there is some wiggle room here, okay? This is not not every single woman does this, okay? This is average, okay? Now, one of the big things we want to talk about is our first, which usually references the first 7 days of the menstrual cycle, of the uterine cycle, and that is called menses. Now, again, menses or menstruation is typically, it could be between day 0 and I'll put like 0 because I'm usually counting it from day 0 here, and I just probably should say day 0 to 7. Now, it can be 3 days or 2 days or 7 days or 5 days. Okay. This one, there's a load of wiggle room. We're going to say an average 7 days. Okay. It could be a little longer than 7 days. If it's a little longer than 7 days, this gets shifted. So that's why I've got this wiggle room in here. Okay. Now, what happens through menses, or menstruation, this is when you lose the layers of the uterus. So then, after you've lost it, it's kind of like I oftentimes kind of think of it like you have a house, like one of those really old homes, like a Victorian home you buy, and you need to have it rebuilt. So you almost gut it. You just basically gut it down to the studs. And then you're going to rebuild it from the inside, remodel it. Okay, it's like you're remodeling an old home. So basically you're going to remove all the old stuff that we got so we can rebuild it and fix it back up. So then you go what's called proliferation. Okay, the proliferation phase. Now, this proliferation phase, you're starting to thicken up the layer. And then here, the longest one is called the luteal phase, which is oftentimes called the secretory phase. I am so sorry. The secretory phase. I was already wrote that. I'm looking over here sometimes, and my brain just does things sometimes, and it's what I get for being tired too. I've been working all day. So this is the secretory phase. Now, so we have proliferation, and we have secretory. Now, secretory about days 14 to 28. And this stuff that happens post ovulation is the most accurate. Proliferation, this is somewhere between day 7 to 14. Okay. So I like to have those days. Now, again, this is average. Not every single woman. Now, case in point, if a woman has, let's say, ovarian cysts, she may actually menstruate almost all but 3 or 5 days. So it really depends on the woman, okay? So let's go through this. This can really help you guys understand what's happening. Now, a normal 28-day cycle, ovarian cycle, FOL, follicular ovulatory luteal, menstrual flow or menstruation, proliferation, and secretory. So I would say full MAPS. Okay. Now, again, these days are there. The ovarian cycle, after a woman has maturated, a bunch of follicles try to develop into secondary and then tertiary follicles, but normally only one gets to be the so-called dominant follicle that can make it. Kind of think of it again like the Hunger Games, where a bunch enter, but only one leaves. Several try to go in, but usually only one leaves. Now, that's normally only one. Now, again, you can have a double ovulation. That does happen. One of the in graduate school, we definitely, we talked about that, discussed that. These are things that happen. One of the nice things you begin to learn as your education develops is the differences, the subtleties, how things are not always perfect, but how it goes. It's always most important to first learn what's normal, but I always like to say, listen, there are, and I say normally because there are exceptions, and I don't want you guys to ever think it's always just this one way and that's the only way. It does you a disservice. Now, ovarian follicles, remember, what they are is an oocyte, various levels of development, found surrounded by follicular cells. So ovarian follicles, these are in the cortex of ovaries. They are an oocyte that is developing, primary, secondary oocyte. Surrounding it are follicular cells or follicle cells, and the oocyte grows and meiosis occurs in them. Now, those follicles can become a primary oocyte. As they develop, it's in the outer part, again, egg nests, and a bunch of those will race to develop to ovulate. Now, if they don't, the rest of them are gone. It usually is just the winners get to ovulate, the rest of them are gone. It's kind of like the Hunger Games. In lecture, I'm always like, 8 oocytes enter, 1 oocyte leaves, welcome to Thunderdome. And basically, as a Thunderdome kind of event happens at once a month in one of your ovaries. Now, the primordial follicle, what it's doing is it's sitting there in its egg nest, and there's a bunch of them, and you can see many of them sitting around here in an egg nest. And around it are follicular cells. Now, the primary oocyte, you have a primary oocyte and the follicular cell. We call this a primordial follicle. Do not confuse primordial follicle for a primordial germ cell. These are already primary oocytes, which means they have already gone fairly far into development, and I honestly wish I knew where the ones that I had drawn were. I know somewhere in here. Oh, here it is. Cool. Okay. All right. Let me put that back up. Now, as I said, there is primordial germ cells, but are not primordial follicles. Primordial follicles have primary oocytes in them. Okay. Don't confuse those two. It can be easy to do. I know that I did as a student at the earlier levels. See, it was 3,000 levels. No, 4,000 levels before I actually took it. So basically what I did is I had human anatomy and human phys my last year And then I began graduate school and took graduate level physiology courses. And what we did was, so it was nice because I had human phys just before giving that, and it helped because then we really went into the details and we talked about. And the first class I had was reproductive phys. So what we want to talk about next is these primary follicles start to grow. Primary oocytes start to grow. We had a primordial follicle. It starts to grow and we get primary follicles. And when you look at it, you're going to see these cells, a primary oocyte, but now it's called a primary follicle because it's surrounded by granulosa cells. You would see granulosa cells. The granulosa cells are the follicular cells that have grown. These will actually have under them what is called a zona pellucida, which is the barrier that actually is there to help prevent fertilization, but it also is highly covered in microvilli, and it helps the follicular cells and oocyte to be able to transfer materials that help in the development. But see, some will be nearest to the nutrients. Some will be nearest to the hormone release. So one will grow faster than the other, okay? Meaning that one gets to become more dominant. And along with the zona pellucida, there is estrogen being produced by cells around called thecal cells. Now, thecal cells and some of the granulosa cells, things like that, these cells, if you happen to be near cells that are releasing hormones that are going to help you grow a little bit, you're near it, you're going to get it first. You're going to grow more. You're going to take more of them up. You're going to get bigger. The others aren't, and they're going to lose the race to ovulate. Now, there may be many primordial follicles, and they may go into primary follicles, and they do. Many go in there. But it will only generally be one. When I talk about it too, there was a show that was popular when I was a young kid, or I don't even know if it was still on, but it was a show that we watched because it was on like TV channels that we had, and it was called Highlander, and there could be only one. So I always think about Highlander when I do this because that's just from my childhood, the show we grew up watching. Based on a movie that became a TV show. So I think of it instead of the Hunger Games, I think of it as the quickening. The granulosa cells, they will thicken, they will begin to separate away from that zona pellucida. You can see them pulling away now. As they pull away and separate the outer layer of the follicle, we call this a secondary follicle. Secondary follicle, you will begin to see this happening. This is a primary follicle that is inside. The granulosa cells separate from the outer layer of the follicle here. As they begin to separate, you will begin to see that separation. That is a secondary follicle. Now, after 8 to 10 days, now we're we're now still in the follicular phase, but remember, we're post by after 7 days, we're during proliferation. Okay. Now, day 10 to 14th is called a tertiary follicle. Okay. Tertiary follicle has a secondary oocyte in it. That's what allows us to go through and ovulate. It is a secondary oocyte inside this tertiary follicle. Tertiary follicles are very well denoted by having this large fluid-filled antrum. It's kind of like you're taking a balloon and you're filling this water balloon up, and then it gets so much water in it, it pops. And that's kind of how I like to think about this. Is the tertiary follicle LH rising so much because of all of these thecal cells were producing estrogens, and the estrogens will cause a dramatic rise in LH, and LH will actually cause this to complete and ovulate. Now, meiosis doesn't, it does make multiple what you refer to as polar bodies. We talked about that. Now, at ovulation, about day 14, a tertiary follicle will rupture, and that releases its secondary oocyte. It's kind of like you've overfilled the balloon. The antrum of the tertiary follicle has gotten so full it popped and blew the balloon out. It blew out our little secondary oocyte. And that is that secondary oocyte will go on to the uterine tubes. If fertilization occurs, it completes meiosis II. And this is actually the end of follicular phase's ovulation. And we immediately turn over to the luteal phase, or the post-ovulatory phase. And the post-ovulatory phase, what you're going to do is it takes about day 16, 17, really when the tertiary follicle cells, the follicular cells, collapse in on themselves. This is almost, to me, like formation of like a black hole or something. It just collapses in on itself and forms a cell called a bit of cells called the corpus luteum, which makes progesterone especially important to produce progesterone, which is important for gestation pregnancy as it prepares your uterine lining by thickening, not ticking, but thickening. This should see thickening. There we go. Sorry about that. What I'll do is uh, mention that. I had to. I sometimes I don't ever see them. That's the thing. I never see typos until I teach, and when I'm explaining it, then I see it. But when I'm reading it, I don't see them. Now, about 12 days after ovulation, you will degenerate this unless fertilization happens. Corpus luteum will degenerate. Progesterone levels drop. Estrogen levels are dropping too. Corpus luteum will go in and start to break apart into what's called a corpus albicans, and the progesterone drops. That's going to set up menses in a new cycle. The ovarian cycle is now ended. New cycle begins at day 0. So 28 days. This is why the post-ovulatory phase is the most accurate. The formation of a corpus luteum and the breakdown into a corpus albicans is quite a bit more the stable aspect of this. So it is the most definitively accurate portion of it. Now, I do always mention, now, if I said assume an average cycle, and I've asked questions like that before. Now, what I do is we talk about that the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the gonads all work together. Now, the thing about males, we said, was I release some sex hormones in very consistent 60 to 90-minute pulses, and then that's good. But not in females. It is more complex. This helps us to connect the cycle of the uterine and ovarian processes together so that what the uterus is doing can respond to what the ovaries are doing. The ovaries are kind of setting the master switch. Their hormones are coming out to coordinate ovulation with uterus to be prepared so that the female's uterine cycle is basically under control of the ovarian. Okay. So how does this happen? Well, one of the things we're going to be talking about as we go through this, I really take it and break it down into a very detailed set and then work through it in a very detailed way. So I am, which is always my fashion to be kind of like that. But our idea is that I have in females, GnRH does regulate everything. But here's the deal. GnRH pulse frequencies are not consistent like males at every 60 to 90 minutes. The frequency and the amplitude change over time. Mostly they are controlled by estrogens that increase it and progesterones that put a damper on it. Progesterones kind of help to slow it down. I always like to say that estrogens energize the GnRH post frequency. Progesterones kind of like to play it down, downplay it. They kind of put it down. Estrogens energize it. Progesterones put it down. Okay, estrogens increase the pulse frequency of GnRH. Progesterone actually decreases it. And this is important. If we look at this and we understand that the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary in females respond very differently to different pulse frequencies. Now, this is fascinating. I am not entirely sure that we know how it happens. If we do, I don't know. I do know that part of it is generally that you have to adjust the receptor levels at different times to get the different frequencies and be able to discern it. But the exact mechanism, I don't know if we actually know. I would be very fascinating to read about it again. Um, when I was in graduate school, I remember we had no papers on it, but it was something that we talked about the differences here. Now, the anterior pituitary looks at the different pulse frequencies. Now, remember, estrogens energize GnRH, progesterones put GnRH down. Okay, put it down. And this anterior pituitary can respond to these differences. At some frequencies, it's sensitive and insensitive to others. For example, at one frequency of GnRH, you will get FSH released. Now remember, GnRH will cause FSH and LH production, but not release. GnRH's frequencies and levels can help us get LH at the other. Now, if you don't have GnRH, FSH and LH production stops. You produce it, but you only release it under certain frequencies. Let's kind of explain this, okay? It's like sometimes I always kind of think about it that me, when I think about it, it's like when you're trying to do certain things. I don't know if anybody ever played, because you think about frequencies, think about music, and it's like you play different songs in Zelda Ocarina of Time or something to make certain things happen. Okay. That shows my age quite a bit, I know, because that was a Nintendo 64 game, and I remember that game came out. Gosh, Nintendo 64. Okay. I feel old. Thank you guys. Okay, I'm gonna go take a nap now. It's probably my bedtime. It's 7 o'clock. It's my bedtime, right? I just got glasses too last week, so I'm getting old. Now, what I want to help you guys understand is with these differences, we set up things. Now, follicular phase is FSH comes in to those developing follicles, and it basically acts as a kick in the butt to make these primordial follicles develop into primary follicles. Monthly, some do. You have primordial follicles, they will develop into primary follicles. These primordial follicles, remember, have primary oocytes in them. Primordial follicles are not the same as primordial germ cell. Do not get those terms confused, okay? Now, they will go in. Now, the cells that are in the ovary that makes the estrogens are called interstitial cells. Now, as you will see, cholesterol is the main source to make all these sex hormones, okay? But there are a few of them. And like in androgens, for example, you probably heard of dihydrotestosterone, DHT, in some tissues. You talk about that. People blame that in the baldness. And if you actually take this and convert it, it's called, the enzyme is actually called aromatase. I never will forget that because it makes this ring right here aromatic and aromatic benzene. So just, that's how I remembered it. Now, progesterones, remember, these are things we called, remember, functional groups. We talk about functional groups in AP1. The functional groups make all the function. So it is estrogens. Estradiol is the most important of the estrogen, but there's estrone and estrol as well, which are also there. But estradiol is by far the most abundant. This is one that has the most powerful function, and even before ovulation is the dominant hormone prior to an ovulation. This is the hormone that sets off ovulation, guys. As its level goes up, you will remember as it goes up, you will excite GnRH, which will cause the LH to be released, which will trigger ovulation. That's the end goal here. We have to kind of understand that in females, we're going to have this thing has to kind of build up first before you get this. It's it's like one of those romance movies. You got to build up to it, okay? So I sometimes think of that. I know that sounds rather sexist. I'm not trying to be sexist, but I realize that sounds rather sexist as me acting. But it's like, okay, females' reproductive cycle acts almost like they're movies where you have to build up to something, okay? You're like, I know these two are going to get together, okay? I just know it. They're going to be together. He's going to finally come to his senses and realize she's everything he needs. Um, okay. So that's how I always like to think of it. I do oftentimes think of things that way. Okay. Now, what we want to help you guys understand is what it does. Now, female secondary sexual characteristics. Okay. Your bone growth, your muscle growth. Why does your muscle and bone look different than males? This hormone, reproductive hormones. Secondary sexual characteristics, like where your body hair tends to accumulate, like generally non-facial hair, and where your adipose tends to accumulate on the hips and thighs and breasts, typically. That also affects the female's sex drive. The hypothalamus, estrogens actually increase the sex drive in the CNS, central nervous system. Remember your sex drive. Now females have a sex drive. I think it's generally something we tend to think of as only men having sometimes. At least back in the day, they used to kind of think that way. But I think now we kind of understand with sexual liberation and our better understanding of sexual behaviors and things like that. There are things. I'm oftentimes kind of reminded of something that one of my professors used to say. He says, as much as men may think that that human females are promiscuous, that is entirely not the case. The men's testes are far too small for females to be promiscuous. Because in animals who have very promiscuous females, sometimes the testes are somewhere between 95% of the male's body mass. I mean, there are animals out there who have basically 95% of what they weigh is their gonad. That sounds like a lot of guys you might have went to high school with, and I guess those diminished. So, um, the functional stuff that goes on here, guys, is also like in males to keep the organs of males going, the functional reproductive glands and organs like the Bartholin's glands and things like that. Well, just like that with males. So males want to have sexual health, they need to maintain higher levels of testosterone. And this also repair and growth of endometrium for the sex hormone, especially when you're dealing with estrogens, progesterone, especially progesterone, which repairs the endometrium and sets it up as and estrogen. Estrogen kind of helps to get it built. Progesterone is going to make it really secrete those endometrial glands we're going to talk about. Now, the endometrium, it's about 10% of the mass of the uterus, but it's incredibly important because this is what meets the demands of a fetus, the demands of an embryo. For the first week, you are purely fed by the lining of the endometrium. It secretes materials and there's a huge amount of development that happens in just a week. I have a video on the topic if you'd like to see it. Now, the endometrial surface, those glands actually go up. Those uterine glands that are in the endometrial line, the uterine glands, I was saying endometrial gland, those are what feed the first week of life. You're fed by those exclusively. There's no placenta yet. But they go deep. And the estrogens cause these, of course, to start to produce and change the uterine cycle because it changes the blood vessels. And if the blood vessels respond to the estrogen, this will start to cause an increased blood flow, which increase nutrient, which means increased growth, which means rebuilding. Estrogens are going to help rebuild for proliferation. Secretory is going to be for the uterine glands, is going to be with your progesterone. Now, the functional zone is where it's at. This is where most of the glands are. This is where the endometrial thickness is. This is what changes. This is what really gets proliferated. This is where secretion and menses occurs. The basilar zone just what attaches it down to the myometrium, and it holds some of the other bits of the glands. But remember, it's going to be the functional zone that's crucial to reproduction. That is the area that is lost during menstruation. Now, as we said, there were changes. Now, it can be as short as 21 days because sometimes as I said, it is 2 weeks for the secretory phase is pretty accurate. 21 days is kind of like a typical to 35 days. Even but now average is 28. Now remember, you can go further, 35 days, 21 days. But it's the ovarian cycle. Kind of think of the menstrual cycle or uterine cycle is under control of the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle, then we have menses, proliferation, secretory. Proliferation happens in conjunction with the follicular phase. Actually, so does menses as well. And both menses and proliferation happen during the follicular phase. And then secretory phase, that happens during luteal phase. Now, there's a reason why the luteal phase with the corpus luteum making progesterone is in conjunction with the secretory phase. And why you make the eggs prior when you have dominant estrogens. Okay? These things are like tag teams. Okay? One comes in, one finishes it off. Okay? Now, menses, you degenerate that functional layer or zone. It's kind of patchy. One little patch sloughs off. As the arteries around it constrict down, blood flow to those areas are now shut off. So those tissues die. Their nutrients are gone and the patches rupture and everything comes off. So you get blood and tissue gets released. And then that is menstruated out the vaginal canal during menstruation. Now, if any woman who has listed this, and if you use a tampon is what you use during your menses, do not leave them in. Toxic shock syndrome is something that can happen that can kill you, pelvic inflammatory disease. Many females do use tampons because that you're not going to see it, things like that. Some prefer to use pads. But if you ever, for some reason, like have a tampon, you inserted it, taken out the applicator, and you cannot remove it, the string isn't accessible and it breaks or something, you need to go to the hospital and have that removed. You'll have to have that removed. Your doctor or OB, something, have to go get that removed because you can die of toxic shock syndrome. These anaerobic bacteria will set up and you can die very quickly. So take it seriously. Menses, as it breaks away, it goes into the lumen and goes out the vagina. Now, it only affects, as we go through the external os of the vagina, it only affects the functional zone because the deeper layers of it have the straight arteries and they're supplied. It is the spiral arteries that go away. And as that sloughs, it can be one day. Now, some women do complete the entirety of menstruation in a day. Some of them go to 7 days, and it is 35 to 50 mils, 1 to 2, like 1.2 to 1.7 fluid ounces of blood. So you got a little over an ounce of blood, or 35 to 50 mils of blood that can be lost through this. Okay, so that is when you guys measure out fluid ounces, that is what we use in America, is the fluid ounce, which, again, America uses a fakakta, nonsensical, imperial measuring system that is really nonsensical and needs to be gotten rid of. Every time the government shuts down, I'm going to try to petition that we move towards the metric system again. But heck, it's like... American government shutdowns, they happen it's kind of like Easter, comes around at least once a year. Now, proliferation phase. What we're going to see, I'm getting tired, so guys, I'm sorry. Even happens when I'm recording and I have no audience in front of me. I'm still telling jokes to you guys. These cells during that are uterine glands. They're epithelial. They'll start to grow and they can supply the developing embryo, at least early embryo, food. It grows, it vascularizes, it restores, and this is all because of estrogen levels. And the follicles are actually preparing at the same time. They're preparing. It's getting ready to be ovulated. So it's kind of like, okay, kind of think of what the uterine and the ovarian cycle is doing. The ovarian cycle, it's kind of like you're a kid off to university. You're getting ready to go through finals week. You're getting ready to be done and leave and come home and spend your time at home. And your parents know you're coming, so they're going to prepare the room for you so that when you're ready, because they don't want you to think that your dad's been tying uh, um, his fly fishing ties in your bedroom, or your mom's turned it into her study or something like that, or her crafting room or things like that. She doesn't want to. They don't want you to know that they've actually really replaced your bedroom. so. Um, so now they're preparing it for you. So when you get back from college, you have a place you'll have your bedroom for you, waiting for you. They're kind of preparing your room. They know you're getting ready to come, so they're preparing for your arrival. And that's kind of what's happening here. Okay. Now, estrogens stimulate the developing follicles. It gets extremely well vascularized. The arteries are pushing out, things like that. So now we go into secretory phase, and the endometrium really begins to enlarge as it gets thicker, higher levels of endometrial glands. This is because the corpus luteum is making that hormone progesterone. It's about 14 days, 2 weeks, and it really peaks. Progesterone product is really about 12 days after ovulation, and the glandular activity starts to decline as the peak of the thickness and all this, and it's kind of like, okay, the corpus luteum is no longer producing hormones. It really goes away, but 14 days, but it reaches its peak about 12 days. So you got a couple days here, and then it goes away. And if pregnant, that'll stay. The fetus will start, the embryo will start to release hormones to let that happen and continue on. Now, one thing I do want to talk about is females have what is called a menarche. That is their first uterine cycle. When they first menstruate, and it's usually around 11 or 12 years old. Some women maybe 13. But let's say around 11 and 12 years of age, a woman has her very first period. It's called a menarche. Menarche is a very difficult time for many women, especially if they are living in an area of kind of greater amounts of sexual repression. But this is that time in their life where they're going to have their first ovulation. And so things really change. Now, normally around 45 to 55. Now, remember, 50 is when you got about 80 in 1,000 chance to have a 80%. It's like, gosh, it's pretty high levels in 1,000 births. So it's pretty high for most. But 45 to 55 is when menopause really kind of starts to happen, and she stops having any uterine cycles. She'll stop to menstruate. She'll stop ovulating. Things like that. Now, this is just normal. Females, after they get older, stop ovulating. Now, but let's say you have a sexually healthy woman. She is still sexually healthy, but she did not initiate menses for one reason, like primary transient, primary amenorrhea. This could be like emotional stress, physical stress, transient, secondary. It could be 6 months or more, or primary amenorrhea where you don't initiate menses. This could be due to lack of nutrients. For example, I have seen people go on social media and they'd be like, well, I'm a vegan and I don't have toxins in my body, so I don't menstruate because I don't have toxins to remove. And I'm like, say this with me slowly: amenorrhea. Now, vegans can be healthy. My wife and I actually primarily are vegan. We slip a little bit, maybe once a week have a little chicken, but that's really about it. But generally, we are vegan almost all the time. So, but that also requires that we have to eat certain things. We have to be very careful that we eat certain things that we add to the diet, so we are getting the appropriate types of fats and appropriate types of things. So we know what we have to have, so we make sure we add those things to the diet. Most of the time, we just add it to everything. I mean, things like that. So, but that can actually cause amenorrhea. Physical and emotional stress can cause women to stop menstruating. People have talked about this. This is actually why some of the women did not menstruate or had menstrual cycle changes due to the COVID vaccination. Is transient secondary is a type of amenorrhea, is because of the stress that was put on the body with the immune response cause that. It is not something that the vaccine did. It is the immune response. Immune responses can actually, a woman can get sick and not menstruate. Cancer, things like that can actually make them non-menstruate. A lot of that may be like starvation. This might be say, hey, right now they're starving. This is not a good time for them to get pregnant. They wouldn't be able to. This would kill them. So it is a good thing that amenorrhea exists, but it can be a sign of some bad things. So if amenorrhea happens, definitely. Now, a lot of college students may not have an OBGYN right now. They may not be able to see an obstetrician. Some primary care physicians no longer do female pelvic exams. So so those things can be kind of scary. So watching for those kinds of signs and knowing it exists is something to be aware of. Now, what I want to talk about, and this is kind of where we're going to break it down, and we're going to go through it step by step, and just talk about how the hormones work. Okay, and what I want to do, I had to take my glasses off because my headphones are pinching on the arms of the glasses, and it hurts my ear. So I had to stop. So the GnRH, what we're going to see is just like in males, you release GnRH from the hypothalamus, and that regulates reproductive functions. Now, in males, that is every 60 to 90 minutes. In females, the cycle, amplitude, and frequency changes throughout the whole cycle. Estrogens and progesterone are what regulates GnRH. Remember, estrogens excite GnRH, where progesterone puts GnRH down. Okay? Now, what happens? Let's say I have very early, this is prior to day 10, okay? I'm in the follicular phase, and right here we have a follicle developing into a tertiary that can be ovulated. Now, what we want to notice that LH and FSH are generally not getting too high as all this is going up. But GnRH is, but it's not going up. Now, FSH kind of goes up with it a little bit. But notice right here that LH starts to go up and really spikes with estrogen. It's because estrogen is causing that release of LH. Now, GnRH causes the production of FSH and LH, causes the release of FSH to stimulate these to develop, but not the release of LH. It is estrogen spike. A mid-cycle surge in estrogen will cause LH mid-cycle surge, which will trigger ovulation. That's how it happens, okay? Follicular development happens, but estrogen is relatively low at the start in the first 10 days. And it starts to go up as the follicular cells start to develop more estrogens. Now, a small amount of estrogen actually inhibits the level of LH. And then once it gets this estrogen levels gets to like a threshold right about here, LH will just dump out, and that will trigger ovulation, okay? Now, at a 36 day, it will go 1 per 30 to 60 minutes. Once the tertiary follicles form and estrogen levels rise, your GnRH frequency goes up tremendously high. Now, something I want to tell you is right here, one of the best indicators that a woman is susceptible to get pregnant is right here with the basal body temperature. When the basal body temperature gets to about 36.5, 97 degrees, 0.7, when it gets a little bit higher, normally it's down here about 97.2. When it goes up about 97.7, that is by far the best indicator for susceptibility to have become pregnant. I know that may take the romance out of it, but when a woman is trying to get pregnant, one of the things you will do is they will give you a thermometer, an ear thermometer or something like that. You'll take that thermometer, the temperature, and when it is, you want to go ahead and have sex so that you have the greatest likelihood of getting pregnant, especially if you're wanting to have it without IVF. And IVF kind of means you're probably, that's how you end up having like Octomom and things like that. because with it you take fertility drugs and things like that. Okay. Now, it is this estrogen, as it gets to a value and it stays at that value for about 36 hours, it exceeds the threshold for about 36 hours, this will make LH dump out. So low estrogen does inhibit LH, but when estrogen goes up high, it stimulates LH, and that bam fires. Now, even though proliferation is occurring, that LH spike caused by the perfect little bit of estrogen getting to this higher level will threshold it out. It will trigger ovulation. Okay. And it is those estrogen levels peak, a massive release of LH. So it is a mid cycle surge of LH that triggers ovulation. So you got to remember that estrogen levels are climbing because of the thecal cells and all this are producing the estrogens. The estrogen levels get high enough, LH is released, LH triggers that. This allows meiosis 1 to complete. This allows the rupture of follicular wall. This means that the primary oocyte gets to go on, become secondary oocyte. It ovulates, and this is ovulation is just about 34 hours, 38 hours, around there. After the surge begins, 9 hours after its peak, which means that right there when the basal body temperature goes up, it's peak time to have sex for pregnancy, if you're wanting to have pregnancy. Now, what's going to happen after that is progesterone is going to start to secrete now because we have the luteal phase. The corpus luteum makes progesterone, so estrogen levels kind of drop down and estrogen goes up, and progesterone levels go up. And this is going to, because the corpus luteum produces it, and that's going to trigger the uterine gland formations, and it helps to cause the secretory phase as long as that's going on. Now, that luteal phase, progesterones are very high for a week. This makes that basal body temperature go high. That progesterone starts to climb. The basal body temperature will start to go up. Pulse frequencies are going, progesterone and estrogens drop. That will allow the pulse frequency of GnRH to go back up and restart the cycle. Remember, estrogen excites GnRH. Progesterone puts GnRH down. And you look at it, look what happens. Whoop, whoop. These two are going like almost like opposite to each other. It's almost like opposite slants. And it's almost like everything I said was right. So remember, if estrogen is very low, FSH is being released. But if estrogen is very high, FSH is not. FSH and estrogen have this kind of antagonistic thing. Is GnRH, remember, is excited, but it's GnRH does kind of help to, is involved here as well, just to finalize that formation. Okay, luteal phase. This is as the corpus luteum is produced, progesterone, estrogen decline. This is going away. The corpus albicans is present. Menses will happen after this, and we start over. This will continue on until estrogen levels rise back up. Okay, and the estrogen levels will help rebuild this, and then the progesterone levels even more. Okay. Luteal phases, I wanted to say the proliferation will actually continue until proliferation sets it up again. Okay, and it is progesterone is especially good for the enlargement of endometrial glands. And that's it. Guys, I hope you found this useful. I do want to mention one kind of disorder. I wanted to have another. It's called placenta previa. The placenta can actually partially or completely block a complete placenta previa, and this blocks the cervix, and this can, of course, cover the outlet for the uterus, and this can cause problems. May require a C-section. It's called placenta previa. I'm going to add some more. I always like to add some diseases to my notes, and I've got some other things I want to add in here, especially for males. It's just time. So, guys, thank you so much. I am done. We are finished with the semester. Hallelujah. We are done. Guys, thank you for everything. And I'm sorry it took me to the right before the last week to get this one out here. It's just there's a lot. So it's taken me a long time to do it. As you can see, I started recording at 1 o'clock sometime this afternoon, and I'm finally finished at 7:34 on a Sunday, working on my days off, trying to get everything done. Guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you for the final. Thank you.